Hello and welcome to the Human and the Machine podcast, the podcast about all things HCI. As ever, I'm your host, Professor Ben Cowan. Today's episode's all about decision making, gamification, and how design affects our choices. We're joined by Dr. Diego Garialdi from UCD's School of Computer Science, who's a leading expert in applying decision making theories to understand why we behave the way we do, and how design influences those decisions. Diego and I have collaborated a lot over the years, and he has an almost encyclopedic knowledge of behavioural theories. I love the way he brings cognitive science into HCI to help us understand things like motivation, habit formation, and also how social media uses these techniques to influence our decisions and behaviours. As a quick reminder, if you like the podcast, don't forget to review and follow us. If you want to get in contact with us, you can by emailing us at humanandthemachinepodcast@gmail.com. Just let us know what you think of the topics, if you have any ideas for speakers, or you just want to say hi and leave us a nice message. All will be welcomely received. Without further ado, please sit back and enjoy.
Thank you very much, Ben. So as he introduced me, I'm Diego Garialdi, working in computer science in UCD. And today I'm going to talk about a few things. So first, I'll just introduce my background, how I got to where I was. So maybe you can understand the process of going from kind of undergrad to postgrad, postdoc, and so on. Then I'll talk about all the parts of my background that led to inspire me to do the current work that I do. And then I'll talk about some of the research I did, why it's interesting in a HCI context, and then I'll also apply it to something that is kind of useful for yourselves. So I'll describe some cognitive theories and why they're important in the HCI context, and then I'll discuss things like, okay, now that we know these theories, how can we apply them in real life? How can we understand how we're affected by technology in real life, not just in research? And that's what I'll try to finish on. So my background started in psychology in Dublin City University, which is on the north side, if you don't know it. It was the first year that we ever had psychology in that university, so our year was kind of the guinea pigs. But it did mean that they focused a lot more on statistics and things like that than they normally would, because they were trying to get accredited. And it kind of made me more interested in that side of thing, the kind of more sciencey side of using theories, using statistics to understand those theories, and kind of hypothesis testing and so on. I know that some places only do 1 or 2 years of quantitative data analysis, and I wouldn't want to put all of that into my head at once. It was way too hard. The final year then in psychology, I focused on motivation. So I was finding that myself, I wasn't motivated enough to do work until the very last minute. And then I found a load of theories trying to explain that. And I was like, yes, I can understand this, not only to better understand the theory, but make myself better. So then that's why I focused on motivation for my undergrad. Then instead of moving straight into an MSc in cognitive science, I actually went and worked a call center operator. And no one liked being called. So then it made kind of doing psychology and research look way better in comparison. So whenever I did return, I was so happy to not be calling people anymore. But one thing that I noticed about the job was that they had this status indicator. So if you were on a call, you would put yourself on call. If you were wrapping up because you needed to fill in people's information, you put it on wrap up. If you wanted to go to the bathroom, you put it on what's called idle. And then if you went on break, you put it on break. And we only had 11 minutes of idle a day. So if there was a queue to the bathroom, forget about it. And it also was interesting because a lot of people would try to game the system. So I really learned about how trying to create limits, punishments, and things like that in a system automatically made people want to avoid it as much as possible in a kind of gamified way. You don't want your boss to find out, but you want to get as much free time for yourself as possible. So one thing that we did was the system would automatically call people, and if they answered, they'd be angry you called at all. And otherwise, it would go on voicemail. And we found out that if it goes on voicemail, we just mute ourselves and then just sit there, and we have 3 minutes of sitting there having fun, chatting to each other, as opposed to being yelled at by someone. So it was one of the first things that made me think, okay, I don't normally try to find ways to get one over on my employer, but they have made this environment that's so specific that it's just changing my behaviors for the worse. So it's one reason why I left, but it was another thing that made me think about, okay, what is it about the environment itself and how rules are made that changes how you behave? So then I went and did my master's in cognitive science. It was really interesting because it was basically technology and psychology put together. And I did some really interesting work on decision-making theories and so on. So I kind of pushed my work further. And then I did a PhD with Ben, as he said, where I went to University College London, University of Birmingham in kind of 6-month stints, which I really recommend if you are doing any research to go to other places because you create kind of a communication and academic community that you can go and talk to and collaborate with later. Right now, I'm on another project with one of the people I worked on my PhD, so I think that it means that I created a good community there. But then lastly, now I'm doing a postdoc in HCI, so basically trying to apply cognitive science theories to HCI. But let me explain what I actually do then. So one of the first things that interested me about HCI, psychology, cognitive science, was what's called the intention behavior gap. So basically, you may know this yourselves. A lot of people have a lot of intentions. You'll say, oh, on 1st of January, I'm going to go and stop drinking, or I'm going to go to the gym, or all of these kind of New Year resolutions that you may have. Or maybe you're going to learn a new language, anything like that. But then what happens is, even though we say we're going to do all those things, even though we are so convicted that this time it's going to be different, when it comes to doing it, it doesn't always pan out. And why is that? That was kind of one of the biggest questions I wanted to find out. How do we explain the disconnect between our intentions and our behavior? So here's an example. If you want to have a look there, there's 2 privacy notices that you might see everywhere ever since GDPR. One of them is different than the other. Kind of the text is different and the colors may be different, but as far as user experience go, there's just one main difference between them. Can anyone see what it is?
The ease of declining.
Yeah. So, one of them, you can decline all as easily as you can accept all. And the other one, you have I accept as front and center. And then if you want to pick another option, you have to click on show purposes. And it's not even clear that it's a button. Like, can you tell that from far away that it's a button? It's more of a text. So it's like they're trying their hardest for you not to notice that it's there at all as an option. And people have actually done studies on this. One example from Nuance et al. 2020, they found that if you did what the first example did, where you moved the reject all option behind a show purposes button, you could increase the amount of people that said accept all by nearly 25%. So even though you ask people, do you think your privacy is important to you? Are you willing to share your data with anyone that asks for it? Any of those questions, people would normally say, no, I care about my data, I care about my privacy, I don't want to share that. But then if you were to ask them, okay, if I make it so you have to do one more click to be able to kind of maintain your intention, is that something that would stop you? Most people would be like, no, obviously I can click twice. I do it every day. So it's something that your intentions say you're going to do one thing, but then when it comes to behavior, you're in a hurry. You don't really know what the problem is with accepting all, so you accept all. Another example of how external factors affect us. A study by Mazar et al. Asked people about their voting intentions. So if I was to come over to you and ask, are you planning to vote in this election? If you're not Irish, obviously you might not be able to, unless it's local. But let's say it's in your own country or anything like that, and I come over and ask you, what's your intention to vote? And you might say, I intend to vote this person or not vote at all. And you might give me reasons. And those reasons would be things like, I don't like any of the candidates, or this candidate is good because he's going to do what I want to happen, or anything like that around kind of the topic. Only about 12% of people, if you ask about do you intend to vote, will say something like, well, the bus is really hard to get there, so I might not. Or last time I went, there was a big queue, so maybe I'll skip it this time. No one, well, 10% of people will talk about that. But when you do a follow-up and ask people, what were the biggest reasons for why you voted today? About 50%, or just as much as intentions, people will say, well, I got the day off work, or it was right beside my house, and things like that. So it's another example of external factors really affecting your behaviors, even though when you're asked about it, you don't even think about them until afterwards. So as far as my research inspiration, why did I decide to do research on what I do? The first one was the intention-behavior gap. So the idea that your intent and goals often fail to predict behavior. Another thing that was inspiring for me was something called operant conditioning. So while I was learning about psychology, I learned about things like operant conditioning, which is the idea that for most animals, even people, for anything that learns and is alive, actions with immediate positive consequences are repeated, and actions with negative consequences are avoided. So in this example here, if you look at the little rat, whenever the top light lights up, it means that he pressed the little lever in front of him, and then he goes to the other light, which is where the food is, and then once that's done, he goes back and pushes the lever, and then that gets him more food, and basically, for every lever press, he gets more food. So he learned an association. It's basically a reinforced behavior. And you might not think that this applies to you because obviously I have all my intentions and so on, but as we saw, the environment is way more effective at changing our behavior than we think. So as much as you might say, well, I'm not a rat, I'm not gonna, I don't know, work for my boss just because he gives me treats. Well, technically you are, because they are giving you money. So here are some examples that I'll refer back to later on in the talk because they have some kind of important implications. But whenever you're trying to create behavior from an organism, an animal, depending on the schedule, so depending on how you present the reward, it affects how quickly they do the behavior. It affects how much kind of active participation there is per second. So it might be like the VR red section. The animal is constantly just pressing that lever and the behavior is going up. Whereas with something like FR, which I'll explain in a second, they'll press the lever and then stop for a bit, press the lever and then stop for a bit, which is why you get that kind of step ladder effect. So there's different things that affect not only the speed, but the rate and whether the behavior is resistant to extinction, which basically just means if you train the rat to press the lever and it gives him food, if you stop giving him food, how long until he stops pressing the lever? So with the examples here, the rat, or mouse, I think, that we saw, was on a fixed ratio of 1. So every time he pressed the lever, he got 1 food. So that's the FR there. And you can see that there's a bit of a slump. So if you know it takes 10 presses to get your food, you do the 10 presses, and then at the minute you get the food, you're at the furthest away you can be from your next food. So you're slightly demotivated, but as long as you start pressing it a bit, then it ramps up again because you're getting closer and closer. Whereas with variable ratio, which is VR, you don't know how many presses you have to do before you get the reward. But once you keep pressing it, eventually you'll get it, sometimes after 1 press, sometimes after 10 presses. So in your mind, you're as equally likely to get it in the next press as you could be, as opposed to the F4 one, because you don't know when it's going to happen. So it could happen as easily as right now. So that's way more motivating, and I'll show you later why this is a very popular technique to get people to do more of something, because you don't know when it's going to happen. Then you have the the interval ones, which are basically the same, except instead of number of times you press it, it's time in between presses. So you might have to wait 10 minutes and then you can press the lever and it comes back, or you might have to wait 5 seconds and you press the lever and you get the reward. And that's popular with things like Farmville, mobile games, anything that has like a timeout, that you won't get your little crops to grow until 20 days pass. That's an example of a variable interval. So remember those because I'll reference them back. But we'll move on to something interesting that I learned, which was called temporal discounting. So the idea here is that the proportion of value of something, so how much you think something is valuable, is dependent on how quickly you get it. So if you look at the thing on the left, if you get that thing immediately, then your perception of value is really high. But the longer that time passes, the lower the value goes, but it doesn't go directly kind of a 1-to-1 ratio. You lose it almost immediately, and then after that it just kind of plateaus a little. And this happens with people. You can ask people about this, do experiments, and you'll see how it works. So with the example here on the right, if you ask most people, would you rather have, in this example, this study, they asked, I think it was Ainsley, 1983, they asked participants, would you rather $50 now or $100 in 6 months? And most participants picked $50 now. And that's a difference of 6 months and 50%, let's say. But if you move it a slight bit, where it's not now, it's in 3 months, but you also move the $100 the same amount. So now there's still 6 months in between both offers, and they're both still 50% different. But now participants will prefer the $100. So before they preferred $50, now they prefer $100. Why is that? Well, if we think about temporal discounting, the value of the $50 right now is at its max, whereas the value of $100 in 6 months is quite low on the scale. Whereas if they're both quite low on the scale, they're both quite far in the perception of time, the difference between them is not that big, so you might as well get the higher amount. And another thing, one of the reasons why this may happen, one of the explanations, is that the longer it takes for you to get the reward, the harder it is for you to associate that reward with the behavior. So if you're trying to train a dog to sit, you might know that you need a sort of scaffolding, so you get the food in your hand, you put it in front of the dog, and it'll sniff it, and then after a while it'll get tired and sit while it waits for you to give them the food. And at that time you say sit and give them the food. And if you keep doing that, eventually the dog will learn that if you go like this and say sit, they sit, they'll get the food. But if you were instead to go like this, wait for them to sit, then wait 3 months and give them the food, they're never going to learn. So one of the reasons then that temporal discounting works is because you're trying to associate behaviors with rewards at all times. And if the reward is so far away that there's no association to be made, it might as well be random. And if it is random, you get things called superstitious behaviors. So if you were to get a pigeon and put him in a box and give him a reward a random amount of times at random intervals, that pigeon will not know why it's getting rewarded. So then it will just repeat whatever it happened to be doing the last time it got rewarded. So if it was doing laps of the box and a reward came out, it might think, okay, maybe I should do laps of the box. And because it thinks doing laps of the box is how to get rewarded, it's more likely to be doing that once a new reward comes out, even at random. So then that's how you get into things called superstitious behaviors. And you might know that yourself if you ever watch a sports game, that if something happens just when you went to the toilet, you might think, oh my God, I caused this because I went to the toilet. That's another example of superstitious behavior. So they actually did studies like this with humans, where they would just reward them randomly. I think about 30% of them caught on. But some of them were even kind of taking off their shoes, throwing it at the ceiling, like doing completely crazy things just to try to get the reward. So those two things got me thinking, okay, temporal discounting rewards more valuable as quickly as possible, and If you want them to do something, reward them for it. If you don't want them to do something, don't reward them for it or punish them for it. And what does that remind me of? Video games. Whenever you are winning the game, doing what the creator intended, you get more points, you get more value, you get more levels, you get things like that. And then if you're not winning the game, you get less points, you get less levels, you get less progress. It's basically a little conditioning box right in front of you, trying to get you to do something. And we find that fun. So then why not use these kind of ideas to make behaviors that aren't fun, that aren't conditioning, that don't give you immediate rewards, change them to be more fun, more conditioning, give you more immediate rewards, using techniques like this. So there's something called gamification. I don't know if you heard about it, but it basically in a lot of things, if people want to do more of that thing, they might take things that happen in games and try to apply it. One of the issues I think with gamification is that they think it's the games that are motivating and not the conditioning. So then they'll make things look like games, or they'll add points to something when the points don't mean anything, without understanding that the points themselves have to be rewarding, they have to be reinforcing, they have to be positive. Otherwise, if you are on, I don't know, the website of Ford because you want to buy a car, and then you're looking through the car examples and they give you 20 points for doing that, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, 20 points. Because those 20 points mean nothing for you in your car buying journey. So it's something that you need to understand whenever applying gamification, is that behaviors need to be reinforced. So the incentive needs to be something that the person wants. So here's 2/3 of my research inspiration. First, it was learning about the attention-behavior gap around my undergrad. Then it was learning about rewards, digital interfaces, gamification, and so on, around the undergrad to master's level. And then later, it was something called dual process theory. But to help you understand this, I'm going to give you another example from video games, which is The Sims 4. So if you've never played this game, or any of the prequels, Sims 1 to 3 also count. The idea here is that it's a life simulation game. So you have your little characters, and you can get them to do anything that, well, not anything, but you can get them to do most things that you can do in real life. They can go, I don't know, do their work, they can sleep, they can eat, they can go to parties, they can work out, they can learn new skills, all of those things. There's no real end goal, you're just playing to kind of see what happens. So the way it works is that you kind of have an overlord view, overlord control of the little guys. They're there, it's not like other video games where you have kind of the control stick and you move them yourself. You have a view of the world and you click around that world and you get kind of little icons of options, and then you can say, okay, go to the bathroom, go make yourself food, go learn how to fix the sink, all the things like that. And then once you make those choices, it creates a little list on the left, which you can see there, which is just kind of a tiled list of things that you decided to tell it to do. And that's kind of an example of human cognition, and I'll explain it more later. But this is kind of the player part of cognition. But the sim itself has its own wants and needs and so on. So you can see that this particular sim really needs to go to the bathroom, is really hungry, and is kind of tired, and medium bored. So their fun levels are low. And what that means is that even if you give that sim a long list of things to do, it's probably not going to want to do most of them because it wants to go to the bathroom, it wants to eat. So then you might say, okay, keep learning how to paint for the next 3 hours, and then the sim itself at some point will just go, no, 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 run to the bathroom and do that instead, and basically disobeys your command. So you feel like you have total control, but you don't necessarily have total control. And then sometimes you also get these little whims, which are ideas of things that the sim is inspired to do, things that it feels like doing at that particular moment, or things that it doesn't feel like doing. And those will affect the game slightly, in that you'll get more inspiration points and so on. And that can kind of remind us of ourselves. So if we are low on the fun end of things, so let's say we're studying, we're at lectures all day, and our fun bar is very low, then if we go home and try and study some more, we're going to be like, oh, this is so boring, I don't want to do this, I'm just going to watch TV. And it's kind of the same if you're playing The Sims. If your fun gets too low, you have to tell them to watch TV, go out, party, whatever it may be, to get all of those things back up, so that when everything is filled, you can tell it to do the kind of less interesting things. And I think The Sims is a good analogy of how our brain works. So there's a lot of dual process theories, which are basically just theories that separate thinking into at least two types or two modes. And let me tell you, there are a lot of them, and I'll show you a list in a second because I've been doing a scoping review on them. But the main idea that they have is that one type of processing is kind of the player in The Sims, which I call model-based, which basically is you making decisions about the future. You think, okay, the best thing to do now, if I want to get more money, get higher grades, blah, 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 is to study, is to sleep early, is to eat well. All of those things that you should be doing. And it does so by thinking about the future, thinking, okay, if I go to the gym 3 times a week for 6 months, I'll probably be 10% stronger, blah, blah, blah. Like, you'll create those models in your head about what will happen if you do this. You don't actually have to go to the gym and do it, first of all. You can intuit that it will happen and predict that it will happen. And it requires attention. So whenever you're doing all these things, you have to think hard about them, you have to make concrete plans, and so on. Whereas the sim part of this, which I call model-free, is all of that stuff I taught you about conditioning. So everything has to be experienced, everything has to be immediate, it happens automatically. So the sim itself is not thinking about what's going to happen, you're the one that's thinking about it, the player. So the sim is just doing whatever comes to it automatically. The sim is very sensitive to emotion and mood and all those things. And it learns from experience, just like conditioning. So if, let's say, I don't know if it's implemented in the sim, but in real life, if you go around walking in the street and then a dog bites you, you might be conditioned to be afraid of dogs in the future. But if someone were to tell you, okay, imagine being bitten by a dog right now, you wouldn't necessarily be scared of dogs just because of that. So one thing requires experience. For you to be afraid of dogs, to have that trauma and so on, you would have to be actively bitten and feel that pain and feel that fear. But if someone were to describe that to you, you wouldn't necessarily have the same experience. And the important thing as well is that it responds to conditioning. So we know this is how we can control the sim part of ourselves, anything conditioning related. So if we know it works with other animals, it will probably work with us, at least on this side of things. Not on the player side, unfortunately, but on the sim side. So one example is from someone called Milkman, where they wanted people to go to the gym more often. So they decided, okay, they know about the intention behavior gap. They know that not only does the player part of you need to understand that the gym is good, but the sim part needs to as well. So what they did was they gave them audiobooks. They chose the audiobook. I think the most popular one at the time was Hunger Games. And the little audiobook player, at the time they didn't have phones that could play audiobooks, was just in the locker. And then whenever you went to the gym, you opened the locker, took out the audio player, listened to your book while you were doing whatever exercise, you put it back when you were done, and then went home. And because you could only listen to the audiobook while you were in the gym, a lot of people came to the gym a lot because they wanted to know what happened. They were like, okay, well, Katniss was just doing this and she was about to die and I need to know what happens. So they weren't there anymore for exercise. And you might say, oh, well, their intrinsic motivation is ruined. But they weren't there for exercise before. So the idea here, what they're trying to do, which is called temptation bundling, is condition yourself to like something first so that when the effects of it come out in 6 months of you exercising, then you don't need the audiobook anymore. You can now see that you're fitter and blah, 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 and you have little habits about going to the gym. So you don't need those things anymore. So now you are someone who habitually goes to the gym. So that's generally the idea. Oh yeah, so these are all the dual process theories from one source. I'm doing a scoping review at the moment, and I found at least 43. There were more that I found after I did all the searches, and I'm not going to keep doing that forever. So this is an idea that has popped up a lot. A lot of people are coming up with the same thing and calling it different things over and over again. It's not like these are chronological. You'll have one in 1999, and then someone in 2001 comes up with the same thing. But then also in 1976, someone already came up with that same thing. So one advice I would give you if you're doing research, please look up theories before you create them. So those are the three parts of my research inspiration. The intention behavior gap, which is the problem. The rewards in digital interfaces, which I thought, okay, these are fun, interesting solutions. And then dual process theory, which is basically an understanding of the mechanism. Why are we doing the specific solution in the way it is happening? What are the predictions that come from this? And if I put the solution into practice and understand how to fix the intention behavior gap, am I learning anything new other than the solution works? Are we learning about people? Are we learning about how decision making operates? All of those things, which I think is just as important as the other two. A lot of research in HCI only focus on the problem and the solution. And then what happens is the solution doesn't work, so then we don't learn anything new. Or the solution does work, and they're like, well, it only applies in this specific setting, so if you're going to do it yourself, you have to try again. And one of the things I try to do in my own research is, if you have a theory that kind of explains everything, if your solution doesn't work, then you learn something new about the theory. If the solution does work, then you learn something new about the theory. And that's way more useful, I think, in research than the alternative. So I'm going to explain one of the experiments I ran and see if that helps you understand how things work. So the experiment was simple. Down there where it says B, it is just the data entry task. So basically, we gave you little statements there. You can see in green. You don't necessarily have to see what's written on them. It basically just says expense statement, the date and time probably, and then a title of what the expense was and how much it cost. And then you have to check against these expense codes on the side, kind of, okay, that's a conference payment, that's probably under this category. And it was just something that would take about 10 to 20 seconds to do that we needed as a task. But that wasn't the important part. Then afterwards, there was a loading delay. So after you got that task, you had to wait about 6 or 7 seconds while the next task loaded. And that was basically it for the task. And the idea was you had 3 companies that wanted you to do tasks for them. They each had different ideas about what would be the best way to pay you. And we're testing out which company is correct. So what happens is you get 2 options when you start a trial, either the green company or the blue company. Depending on what you pick, you get their statement. You get paid in whatever way they chose. You get the loading delay, and then you start all over again. And there was about 40 of these. And they all disagreed on payment. So let's say the first one, pre-task, that company thought, okay, I want them to choose me. I know that temporal discounting works. So if I want them to choose me, I should reward them. I should give them payment as soon as they choose our company, because that's what I'm rewarding. That's what I want them to do. The post-task company was thinking, okay, well, I want them to do the task, so I should reward them after they do the task. And the last one, the delay company, didn't care. They were like, well, I want to check if they did it right, so I'm going to delay their payment until afterwards. And what's the difference? They're all getting paid the same anyway, so I might as well give them the same. And the idea here in the experiment, I think you got about 10, 20 cents per each one of these you did right. And whatever option you picked, you still got your 10, 20 cents. And at the end of the experiment, everyone had the same amount of money. The only difference was one of them gave you the representation of payment right after you chose them, one of them right after the task, and one of them at the very end of everything. Does anyone want to predict what happened?
People went for the pre-task more.
The pre-task? Yes. So if you thought, okay, rewarding, the first thing that would happen is what people would prefer. That's what happened because, assumedly, temporal discounting. So if you look on the right, the pre-task is the highest, and then the post-task is quite far down from that, and then the delay is slightly further less down. So if you remember the curve that we had, this one, that's what you expect because the pre-task rewards you immediately. The post-task is a little bit further, so it should be quite a bit down, and then the delay is slightly further down, so it should be a kind of curved, which is what we found. So that tells us something about our theory. Not only did we have a prediction about there being a difference, but we had a prediction about how much difference, and that came out as well. So we're learning about the theory again. And not only did people select one more than the other, so the little dashed line would mean that they had no preference. And if all the choices were there, then it meant that people had no preference, it didn't matter. But because the lines move one way or another, that means that there was preference. And even when we asked people afterwards, did you have a company that you preferred? Most of them, about 57% or 53%, said that they preferred the pre-task, as opposed to 27 that said they preferred post-task, and only 16 that preferred delay. So not only are we changing their behavior, but we're changing what they like. That's interesting. I'll skip past that. But you're thinking maybe, okay, you're giving them money. What does that have to do with games? So I decided, okay, let's do it again. All participants get paid the same as long as they complete the tasks, except this time, depending on the company they choose, they'll get one of those coins. And every time they get a coin, they go up this leaderboard. And we made it so, depending on how far you got the experiment, you'll probably go about 2/3 up, at least. So people wouldn't be at the very bottom of the leaderboard and think, oh my God, I'm never going to get this. And this time we had the pre-task again, the post-task just as before. And then we had, instead of delay, because we knew delay, no one's going to like that. That's not really interesting right now. We had no reward, which meant you'd still get paid, but you just wouldn't get to go up the leaderboard. And if people really cared about just payment, they didn't care about the gamified reward at all, then there should be no difference between that one and the other ones. But if they do care about reward, then they should prefer either the pre-task and post-task. And if they care about temporal discounting in terms of gamified rewards, then they should prefer pre-task. So not only do we have several specific predictions about what will happen, we have the direction, and if none of them work, we learn something new about the theory. Not just that the method was bad. And then once again, we got the result that people preferred the pre-task, they selected it more, and actually they selected it more now than when they got paid for it. So this is really interesting as well. It seems that the gamification was even more motivating to them than being paid 10 to 20 cents, which I feel like kind of makes sense. Sometimes I feel more competitive than I would for 10 cents. So that's something interesting that I think I got from the research. So the idea here about the implications that come from this are then the environment can affect your choices. So even if you think minor things like having your phone on your desk while you're studying is not going to stop you from studying, well, it might not, but it's not helping. So one of the things you can do is the third one there, remove temptation. So if you know that when you're studying, you do about 20 minutes, feel a bit bored, pick up your phone, and then don't study for 30 minutes. Maybe reflect on that and think, okay, maybe I shouldn't have my phone there. Another thing is change the environment to reward early. So like the thing I talked about, the temptation bundling with Milkman's study, if you want to go to the gym more, then maybe only watch your favorite show while you're on the treadmill. Or say, okay, well, I'm going to get this extra good coffee I really like right before I go to the gym, and that will be my motivation. Because if you look at your environment and it's constant, and you look at your behavior and it's constant, but you want to change it, your intentions don't seem to be working so far. So maybe let's try something else. Okay, so I'm just going to give you some examples from social media now, not just research, but what can you apply in your real life So some of the examples you can get from social media as rewards are visual rewards, positive emotions. So if you see cute animals, attractive people, art, nature, funny videos, engaging videos, etc. These are all positive emotion. And then punishments would be things like, okay, it's really hard to find how to delete my account. It's really hard to quit this app. Things like that where it's kind of pushing you away. Now, funnily enough, negative emotions are not necessarily punishments. So if you go on a website and you see something fake or that is fear-mongering and you become scared or angry, the emotion is a negative emotion, but the best way for you to get rid of that emotion is outwards. So if you are angry because someone said something really dumb on the internet, then the best way to get rid of that anger is to attack them on the internet. And then that removing the anger is the positive emotion there as opposed to the thing giving you anger. So there are positive ways to get you to do more of a behavior, which is positive reinforcement. There are negative ways to get you to do a behavior, which is negative reinforcement, but they all work kind of similarly. Oops. And they're habit forming. So habit forming is basically another word for something that's conditioned into you. So you might notice that if you are watching TV, sometimes you get bored. Whenever you get bored, you go on your phone, you miss half of the show, then you get the feedback from your phone, you saw something interesting, blah, blah, blah. So then you're like, okay, every time I'm bored, I should look at my phone, and that's your feedback loop. So then afterwards, if you're watching another show and you get slightly bored, you'll pick up your phone, and it will do the same thing again. So then you're kind of in a cycle. And then if at one point you're watching a show and you forget your phone in the other room, you might even find yourself phantomly picking up your phone at a bored section because you have that habit now. It's what you do whenever you're bored, you look at your phone. So that's one of the things that social media companies want you to do, have a habit of looking at your phone so that whenever anything in the environment triggers that in you, you immediately look at your phone. And how they do these things are simple. So with the feed, it's basically what I call the variable reinforcement schedule. I talked about it before. Things that you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know how much you're going to get of it, but it is sometimes rewarding, are the most addictive, the most resistant to change, the most resistant to extinction. So if you have an algorithm that gives you stuff, sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's good, that's the best way to keep you online. Another one is pull to refresh, basically like a slot machine. Sometimes you get good content, sometimes you don't. Again, the variable ratio because of algorithms. Before, when it was chronological, it was variable interval, but that wasn't as stimulating, so they go for this instead. Another one is infinite scroll. So before, I don't know how recently they did this. I just noticed that if you Google something, they don't have pages anymore. It used to be, it would say Google with like 10, 20 O's, and each O was a page. But then I went to check that today, and it doesn't anymore. It just goes forever. So the idea of pagination is that if you have your feed on one page, then you have to actively decide, okay, I want to continue scrolling, so I'm going to click on the next page, and then you move on. That's an active decision. Whereas if you have infinite scroll, you're just doing what you always do, which is go to the next content, and you don't ever have to think about it. Everything seems to be doing this now. Netflix will do it. News articles will do it. Obviously, TikTok does it. All of these things are so you don't ever get the player part of you thinking. It's only ever the sim. Another one is notifications. So if you're not on your phone, then you can't be in the reward cycle, the reward mechanism. So whenever you're concentrating on something else, they'll want to give you as many notifications as possible so that you come back. Instead of batching all of these, let's say at 5 p.m. when they know you're finished work, which is probably what you would want, they'll drip feed them to you. Sometimes they'll get 10 notifications, but they'll only give you one at a time, just so you keep checking your phone. So these are ways that whenever you are away from your phone, without your reinforcement mechanisms, maybe you do have that cue of when you're bored, look at your phone, but that's not good enough sometimes. So maybe you're not looking at the right apps, but if they have notifications turned on, which most of them used to by default, now I don't think they can anymore, then that's the best way to get you back in that feedback loop. And then the last one I talk about is status quo bias, which is basically if something is pre-selected, then you have to make the active decision to get off of it, whereas if it's not pre-selected, then you have to make the active decision to get on it. So if you are buying something from a website and they pre-select, please give me ads for the next infinite years in my email box, and it's pre-selected, then you have to actively find it, select it, and go, I don't want this. Whereas if it's not pre-selected, I don't think a lot of people would go out of their way to be like, yes, I do want this. So that's another example of status quo bias. They can also pile on several things at once. So not only are you pre-selected to get these things, but to turn them off, it's the most difficult thing in the world. So I think some things you can one-click order online, but if you want to cancel your subscription for whatever it is, you have to ring them up in specific hours, go through kind of a whole rigmarole on the phone where you select option 2 and then 3 and then 5. And then eventually they'll let you delete your account if you didn't give up already because you were waiting on the phone for 2 hours. So all of these are examples of giving you the choice, but trying at every point to make that sim part of you give up. One thing that Instagram does is that they don't let you delete your account on the app. Even though most people create and use their account on the app, you have to do it on the website. Facebook, when I wanted to delete my account, I had to Google how to do it because I couldn't find it by myself. And when I Googled it, there was a link, and that took me to the part of Facebook where I needed to go. I still don't know how to get to it the normal way. If you are deleting your account, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to show pictures of all your friends and go, look at all the people who will miss you. So they have a lot of techniques, and you might think, oh, well, I'm not going to be affected by that. You might not, but if you consider the sim part of yourself part of you, then you might be. So some remedies that you can think about as I finish. Turn off notifications. I know that they're not default anymore. I think both most recent versions of Android make them ask you the first time they want to give you a notification if you want them. So never say yes to that. Maybe for messaging. You can. Add breakpoints. So if you know something like TikTok has infinite scroll, then at least add the option at the end of it where I think in the settings you can say after 20 minutes, at least tell me what I'm doing. So then you have an active decision you have to make where you go, okay, it's been 20 minutes. I still want to keep going. The other one is remove cues or triggers. So if you know that boredom makes you look at your phone while you're watching a show and then you miss half the show. So then you look at your phone some more because you don't know or understand where the show is going. But you want to go back and actually watch the show. So maybe move your phone away because you know that's the cue or the trigger. Change the status quo. So whenever you go on a website, if something is pre-filled in, immediately unfill it in before you even read it. And then you can actively decide if you want it filled in. Understand emotional triggers. So some people on a lot of social media know that anger will get more clicks and more messages. So they'll act stupid on purpose. They'll say wrong things on purpose. All of these things that people know will make you angry. And then if you are thinking, oh, I'll really show them if I put in this message, you're basically giving them money. So know that they're actively trying to anger you. And if someone was actively trying to anger you in real life, you wouldn't keep engaging with them. You'd kind of cut them off. And the last one is understand the algorithm. I think this is more related to TikTok. But because whenever you skip a video, whenever you linger on a video, all of these things, it's kind of taking it in to know, okay, this is the kind of thing that person likes. These are the kind of things that they don't like. If you go and see a video that you think is horrific, and you're like, I never want to see a video like that again. But because when you were looking at the video, you were like, oh my God, is that really oh wow. Like you're really lingering on that video, then what TikTok now knows is that you will linger on that video. So they'll show you more of those videos. So if you see even a hint of what you think is that thing you don't like, never linger on the video. Just like skip. Otherwise, you'll get nothing but that video. So those are the things, basically, I wanted to say, why cognitive science research is good for your own personal research, but also why it's good for your own personal life. Thank you.
Thanks again, Diego. Those tips are sure to save me all the time from scrolling away on social media. Again, if you like the podcast, please don't forget to review and follow us. And if you want to get in contact with us again, you can by emailing us at humaninthemachinepodcast@gmail.com. Again, let us know what you think of the topics, any ideas for speakers, or even if you just want to say hi. We're happy to hear from you. All that's left for me to say is, stay curious and don't let the machines get you down. Until next time.